Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine 18 Tarot and Books. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome or welcome back. Welcome to a triple book review. I've never done this before, reviewing 3 books in a single book review video, but in this case I think it makes sense because a tarot deck that I love, the Wildwood Tarot, has 3 different companion books. So what I thought I would do is share my thoughts on each of these 3 books, all of which I have here and all of which I purchased with my own funds. I plan to do a deep dive video featuring the Wildwood Tarot at some point, but I knew I wanted to review all of these books, and I knew that that would take enough time that it would probably warrant being put in its own video as opposed to being kind of buried inside of a deep dive look at the deck itself. So I've decided to just do this review video focusing on the books. So the 3 books that I'll be looking at are The Wildwood Tarot, Wherein Wisdom Resides by Mark Ryan and John Matthews. This is the book that comes with the tarot deck in the kind of large box that you'll see the deck comes packaged in. The second book that I want to talk about is A Year in the Wildwood by Alison Cross. And the third one is Wild Magic, the Wildwood Tarot Workbook, also by Mark Ryan and John Matthews. And the artwork in this deck is by Will Worthington, and that artwork features in these books as well. So this is a interesting kind of thing where the same deck has multiple books. We don't see this happen too often. But I would say that the Wildwood Tarot very much is a deck that warrants multiple guidebooks or a lot of supplementary textual support. It is a deck that I love, and I will talk about that in my look at the deck. I will just say here that it is very much a deck that has its own system. Some cards in the deck appear fairly Rider-Waite-Smith influenced, and indeed some cards are fairly Rider-Waite-Smith influenced. If you look at Major Arcana 9, for example, this is quite readily recognizable as a hermit card to someone who's familiar with the Smith-Waite system. There's a lot of extra symbolism in the card, but it reads like a hermit card, right? But there are a lot of cards for which that is not the case. Many of the minor arcana cards, deviate quite far, I would say, from the Smith-Waite system. The court cards are certainly very different. So it's not a deck, I don't think, that you get the most out of if you just pick it up and try to read it with a Smith-Waite knowledge base. There's definitely more going on in this deck than that. So I think that having 3 books for one deck does make sense in this case. I will mention at the outset here, though, that these are 3 guidebooks that are very much then Wildwood Tarot specific. Right? A lot of tarot deck related books, guidebooks, are transferable to some extent between different decks. I would not say that this is the case for any of these 3 books. These 3 books are really going to only be of interest for the most part to those who are working with the Wildwood Tarot or who have worked with or are interested in working with the Wildwood Tarot. There is some content that would be workable with other decks, and I'll identify very specifically what that is as I go through, but these are very deck specific books, okay, in all 3 of them. So I will mention that right at the beginning as well. I mean, if you're not interested in the deck, you're probably not interested in this video, but it bears mentioning. So I'll start first then with the Wildwood Tarot, Wherein Wisdom Resides. And again, this is the book that comes with the deck, right? This one, I would say, of the 3, is absolutely indispensable to working with this deck in a good way, in my view. And it's good that that's the case because this is the one that you don't have to buy separately, right? If you purchase the deck new, you will get this. So this is the one that you need. You can work with this deck with this book and nothing else. The other two are very much, I think, supplementary. Really nice supplementary, but supplementary. So this is the one that you absolutely need. There's a lot of symbolism in this deck. And I would say that this deck is not particularly a beginner deck. I think that for me, if this was my first deck, I would have struggled. There is a lot of symbolism and layering in the imagery of this deck. But this guidebook, I think, does an excellent job of making this potentially quite difficult deck much more approachable and accessible. This guidebook is, in a lot of ways, really what I want a tarot guidebook that comes with a deck to be like. This makes the deck comprehensible, I think, regardless of skill level or experience level with tarot. I still don't think it's an ideal beginner deck personally, but with this book, I think it could be. If this was the deck that really appealed to someone, I think with this book it could be. Okay? And so in terms of the contents of the guidebook, it starts off with a preface by Mark Ryan and a preface by John Matthews. We then have an introduction, and then we get into the cards and their meanings. Okay? The introduction situates the Wildwood Tarot in relationship to its predecessor, the Greenwood Tarot, and gives some kind of introductory information about the philosophy behind the deck, the ideas that inform the deck, and it's an interesting read. One of the things that they address, and this is in Mark Ryan's introduction, that I will mention specifically, since it's something I talk about a lot on this channel, is gender in the deck. Okay? So, they write, the Wildwood Tarot is a journey, not a hierarchy. And to this end, we have, where fitting, made the human aspects in the major arcana androgynous so as not to deny anyone access to these archetypes. Okay? And they describe it being unwise to narrow parameters by trying to fit qualities into our modern conception of gender. And they're specifically talking about binary conceptions of gender, right? They write, where the primal aspect of this archetype is conceptually masculine or feminine, we have worked with them as they rested most comfortably with us. Okay? And so there is a degree of androgynous representation in this deck, which I think is interesting. And certainly in the guidebook, I think, something that stands out in this respect is that the court cards are described in pretty gender neutral terms. For folks who are unfamiliar, the court cards in this deck, and of course I'll get into this in the deep dive with the deck, in a later video. The court cards in this deck are all animals. And they do use the conventional titles page, knight, queen, and king. But when you read the guidebook entries in this book, and the entry talks about, for example, that a card could represent a particular person in your life, it is written in a way to make clear, for example, that a king card need not represent a man in your life specifically, right? So there is that degree of gender neutrality in this book. I think it could go a lot further, right, for sure. But I think that there's an effort made at gender inclusivity here. It doesn't always 100% go the way that I would hope, but it's there. Okay. The guidebook also contains the trajectory of the majors aligned with the Wheel of the Year. So really central to this deck is the conception of the Wheel of the Year and the model of the Wheel of the Year seasons, and festivals. They have a diagram explaining the wheel of the year here. And this is where I think this deck could be okay for someone who is a tarot beginner. If they're coming in with a kind of framework of knowledge around something like the wheel of the year, this would be more comprehensible to them. So the guidebook goes through the alignment of different major arcana cards with particular seasonal times, right? Explaining that, the time of arrows, for example, and arrows would be the sword suit or air suit, begin February 1st. We meet here the card the ancestor, the pole star, the archer, the stag. In the time of bows, which would be wands, this starts on May 1st, and we meet particular cards through that season. So this is a nice way of working with the deck as well. And then from there, it just goes straight into the card descriptions. And this book has monochromatic card images that are smaller than the size of the card itself. So you can see here, you don't get the full color, but you get a good clear image of the card in question. And I really like the card descriptions in this deck. This spans, let's look at the page numbers here, pages 36 to 139, so about 100 pages in fairly small font, 100 pages of card meanings for the 78 cards, which is, I think, really great. This is what I like most about this guidebook, certainly. So to just give an example of what these entries look like. For a major arcana, you get 2 full pages there. And so for this major, and I'm just looking at the Wanderer, which is the Fool as an example, it gives you an image of the card. It describes the position in the Wheel of the Year. It gives you a section called Description, which is describing the artwork in the depiction of the card. Poised on the edge of a white chalk cliff, the wanderer prepares to step across the abyss and into the wildwood beyond. Ahead lies the faint suggestion of a rainbow arch, onto which the wanderer must step. This leap across the void is greeted with open arms and a deep trust that the wings of imagination and honesty will carry the figure onto the lush green turf of a new path. And it specifically notes that in this case, the Wanderer is a card that is not depicted as, specifically male presenting or specifically female presenting. It notes the bare feet and so on. So a very clear description of the symbolic choices in the representation, describing the artwork in the deck. Right? This is something I love in a deck guidebook, especially for a deck that goes so far away from, for example, Smith-Waite, right? Very clear indications of why the artwork was done the way that it was, and the intentions around how the components of the artwork are to be interpreted. You then get a section called Meaning, which is multiple paragraphs long explaining the meaning of this particular card. And then there's a paragraph called Reading Points. And this is essentially what this card could mean in a reading. For the Wanderer, you have come to a junction or turning point in your life. It may be an unconscious state in which you feel the tide has turned or sense something is going to happen, and so on and so on. And it gives you several possibilities. And then there's a little box called Roots and Branches. And these are kind of little connections that you could make to the particular major card. So for the Wanderer or the Fool, the Roots and Branches is blind faith, a blank slate, the inner child, the leap in the dark, following your heart, the seeker after knowledge or truth, the primal impulse, a vision of illumination that pulls you forward. So kind of little connections, little keywords, not quite interpretive keywords, but more kind of archetypes that this card could represent, for an example, right? And so all of the majors get this level of attention, which I think is really fantastic. To give an example of a court card, the court cards each get 1 page. So you can see here, it's a page each. And you get the name of the court card, example, Queen of Arrows, the animal depicted, in this case, swan, the position on the wheel and the wheel of the year, a short paragraph of meaning, and some of these are quite specific. So for the Queen of Arrows, which is a card depicting a swan, the meaning section reads, "This graceful and powerful bird has long been associated with myth and legend. From the Greek Leda, transformed into a swan after mating with Zeus in this form, to Elsa of Brabant in the stories of the Grail Knight Lohengrin, the swan is a strong and regal protector." And from there, it goes into the reading points section. And for the court cards, the reading points are divided into several possibilities. There's a kind of general reading point, and then there are suggestions for the card as a person in your life, the card as an aspect or process, the card as an event or happening, and then questions. Questions you can ask related to this card when it comes up. For the Queen of Arrows, which is again swords, the questions are, what help do you need to accept or ask for? What straightforward approach is needed here? How do you cut through the tangle? And then you get tracks and pathways, which here are purity, loss, change, suffering, song, absence, scarcity, and freedom after strife. So kind of a set of keywords. So quite a lot for a court card, right? And then for a minor, similarly, you have 1 page each for the minor arcana cards. You get the description, a very clear description of the imagery. So for the 6 of bows, in the heart of a forest clearing in a 6-spoked, star-shaped log fire formed from trimmed but unfletched bow staves. It radiates light and heat and forms the pattern of the seasons. The fire is surrounded with representations of all manner of natural forest riches from the summer season. So very specifically what the artwork depicts. You get the short paragraph on meaning, and then you get reading points. And here, unlike the court cards, the minor arcana, the reading points is 1 long paragraph as opposed to being divided up into different possibilities. But you get quite a lot, right? This is amazingly thorough and very specific again to the representations in the deck, which I think makes it a good and functional guidebook, right? Very much so. After all of those card entries, there's a section called Finding Your Way, Working with the Deck. And here you get this kind of very welcoming, everyone has a favorite method for laying out the cards, right? And though the Wildwood Tarot can be utilized with any of the traditional spreads, we welcome and encourage experiment. What follows are a few brief notes to help you widen your understanding of the pack and 3 spreads which will take you deeper into the Wildwood. So it gives you 3 spreads to work with. A 3-card spread, a bow spread with the inspiration of a bow, and you can see the picture of the bow there, and the world tree spread with an image of the tree. Now this is where the content is not deck specific. These spreads are very much inspired by the deck and inspired by the guidebook, but there's no reason that you couldn't, for example, read a Wisdom of the World tree spread with any deck, right? There's nothing structurally about this spread or any of the 3 spreads that demands that you use the Wildwood Tarot to perform them, right? So if you really liked the spread, you can use it with any of the decks that you have. Something brilliant about this that I have not seen very often in a guidebook, and another reason why I think this guidebook maybe takes this deck to a place where it could be a beginner deck, is that it gives you sample readings for each of the spreads. So for the 3-card spread, for example, using the pathway spread, they give you an example of if card 1 is Major Arcana 8, the Stag, card 2 is the Moon, and card 3 is the High Priestess, which in this deck is called the Seer. And it explains an interpretation of that reading with those 3 cards chosen for a specific question. The question given is, Jim is trying to decide whether to seek new partners for his small company in addition to familiar colleagues whom he knew and who already knew him. Very clear the kind of question that a querent might come with, right? A work question is a very popular kind of question. And it does this for all three spreads. It gives an example, right? One of the readings then is about long-term relationship. And the third one is about whether or not to take a transatlantic holiday, which had been booked, but seemed like it might be affected by other things. Fantastic. And it explains how each card is interpreted in the context of the placement, in the spread, and in the context of the question. Very, very useful. Very useful, right? And so that, I think, makes this book more beginner friendly. Okay. So, all in all, I think that this is a really good guidebook, and it leaves you some blank pages at the end. You can put your notes in the back. And then there's just, about the authors, about the artist, thank yous, further reading, okay? Further reading and some resources. So, to sum up, this is a really good deck guidebook, in my opinion. You get a lot here for something that comes with a mass market deck. It is very highly deck specific, with the exception of, I would say, the spreads you could really use with any deck. But other than that, this is very intimately tied with the Wildwood Tarot, and this is what makes it a really good guidebook. Okay? Great. The second book that I would like to talk about is A Year in the Wildwood by Alison Cross. And Alison Cross is someone who has for a long time managed the Wildwood Tarot website, is my understanding. She's also, reads the back of the book, a former chair of the Tarot Association of the British Isles, okay, and is an author of another deck herself. So, this book, A Year in the Wildwood, the idea is that you can follow the Wildwood Tarot deck through the Wheel of the Year. So it gives prompts for different dates, and it assigns every card in the deck a span of dates, some of which are quite long, like a season, others are quite short. The idea being that you kind of work through this in order. The book absolutely states, you can do this in any order you want. You can start at any time. You don't have to use the dates provided if they don't, for whatever reason, work for you. For example, if you're, I think, in the Southern Hemisphere and had a different cycle of seasons, you might want to do this in a different order than what is laid out here, right? The way that this is set up is to begin on February 1st and go through the year from there, starting with the time of arrows, which is spring, arrows being the air suit. Then we have bows, the fire suit for summer, vessels, which is the water suit for autumn, and stones, the earth suit for winter. This alignment of suit and element with season matches with how revival druids tend to match up element and seasonal correspondences. So this really works for me in terms of the order things are in and the suits that you're working through in each given season. It may not for everyone. That's not a shortcoming of the book. The book is very clear about this, right? You need to work through it in the way that makes sense to you. You can use the book however you want. I decided to work through this in the way that it is outlined. I got myself a blank notebook. It's a Stalogy plain grid notebook. And I designated a page for each of the cards, sometimes a little more, but usually a page for each. And I worked my way through. And sometimes I wasn't exactly on time. Sometimes I, deviated from the dates a little bit, but I worked through things in order and in the seasons suggested. Right? And I had a great time. I really liked this process. It definitely contributed to my knowing the deck better. So in terms of what this book includes, there's a foreword by John Matthews. There is a preface by the author talking about the publication of the deck in 2015, the publication of Wild Magic, the other book I'm going to talk about in just a minute, in 2017. Then this book came later. And then there's a couple of updates. The book goes through the quarter days and cross quarter days of the Wheel of the Year and some of the kind of disagreement on, what things are called and where things come from a little bit. It provides charts of the dates for each of the cards. So as a reference, the appendix gives you all the dates for each major, and then there's a chart for each court and a chart for each minor. So there's that handy reference, but then the body of the book is card by card entries in the order that you're intended to work through this, okay? The appendices also include a kind of one card draw prompt for each of the 8 Wheel of the Year holidays, and then a section called Secret Paths, which is referred to Ruth Ann and Wald Amberstone and their book Tarot Tips, which involves looking at where symbols duplicate across different cards in the deck. So this was a section that I quite liked, and it goes through, for example, cauldrons are found on Major Arcana 2, 3, 4, 8, and 9. 8 and 9 of vessels. Corvids are found on major cards 13 and 18. The crane bag is depicted on the seer card and the mirror card, and so on, and it goes through symbol by symbol as something that you might look at as a way of exploring the deck as well. Now, there's a lot I like about this. I certainly like the concept of, with a Wheel of the Year based deck, working through it over the course of the year. And I really liked the experience of doing this. And I can imagine even doing this with other kind of seasonal pagan adjacent, druid adjacent decks, doing something like this, right? What didn't quite work for me at points is, I think, issues that ultimately come down to the fact that this book is based on, I think, blog posts or Facebook posts or something like this. Website posts. Okay, so the card by card entries, as I understand it, appeared on the deck's website first, presumably kind of periodically following the seasons, and then were put together into a book. I think this makes a lot of sense. I also think that there are some issues in terms of editing that are a result of the fact that this was web posts first. Using capital letters for emphasis, like you're yelling in an email, is a web thing. I don't think in a book that it works. There's just some places where I think some more editing would have really made this a little bit better. It is fairly short. Only pages 23 to 165 are the actual walkthrough of the year. And the font in this book is huge. It's like a sans serif size 15, maybe. It's pretty big font. And I'm not opposed to big font, certainly for an accessibility consideration. I think larger font can make a book more readable for more people, and I think that that's a good thing. It does bring attention to how short this book is, I will say. This is a kind of book I think that someone will get a lot out of if they're interested in the Wheel of the Year and also interested in this deck. I really enjoyed the process of working through this book. I will say it's the kind of thing where the entries to me are a bit inconsistent. they're inconsistent in terms of length, they're inconsistent in terms of what they include. Some of the entries, for example, just the Queen of Bows, some of the entries include kind of reflection questions or journal questions in a list. Some of them don't. So if you wanted to kind of journal the reflection questions only, some cards would give you several and some cards would give you none. Some read a bit more like guided meditations almost, whereas others read as more kind of, this is what the card means, this is the message for you today, kind of a tone. And I think that this is just a function of them probably being written over a fairly large span of time, right? So something that you will have to do when you work through this book, that I found, is there is a certain amount of personal work involved in reading the entry and then deciding how to make that entry meaningful for you. And I think that that's an important process that is why working through this book was so enjoyable, right? For each of the entries, I kind of have to decide, am I going to journal the questions provided? Am I going to treat the questions provided like spread positions and do a reading with the deck? Am I going to consult with one of the other books to bring in something else to work with? Am I going to, meditate on something? There's a lot of options, right? This is a very open-ended book, and I think that that's a great thing. This is a book you could work with in a lot of different ways. It doesn't tell you what to do. So you have to figure out a way to make this book work for you. If you are willing to put in the work of that, then working through this book is a fabulous experience, I found. So that is A Year in the Wildwood. The third book that I would like to talk about is Wild Magic, the Wildwood Tarot Workbook, again by Mark Ryan and John Matthews, the creators of the deck. This one, like the deck guidebook, includes these kind of monochromatic card images. The font is, I think, the same. The layout is very similar in a lot of ways. It includes the table of contents on the inner flap, which I think is kind of fun. I really like this book. I think it might suffer from a bit of a miss market, I will say. This book is a wall of text. When I think workbook, I think that I'm going to be filling in with a pencil. I think that it's going to be, write in the box or fill in the blank or use this page to reflect on such and such. This is not that. Okay. So where I think this book might let some folks down is if you buy this thinking that you're going to get a workbook in that sense. I wish it was called something else. However, the contents of the book are really interesting. So that is really only a criticism of the marketing and not the book itself. The book explains, the authors explain in the book. The book doesn't explain anything. The authors explain that in the original book that accompanied the deck, the first book I discussed, we did not have a lot of room for practical exercises and could only include a couple of spreads. In this book, we can finally put this right, using some of the work we devised for the workshops that we were able to do in the first year of the deck's publication, and other ideas that we have spent time working on since then, adding deeper levels of understanding and knowledge that underlie the imagery on every card. This is where this being called a workbook came from, right? Is that it is contents that relate to workshops. It is kind of activity based, some of it, in that way. So I'm not like mad at it that it's called a workbook. It's not what I would think of when you think of a workbook. So you get a table of contents, and the table of contents identifies who wrote what. Some of the sections are Mark and John writing together. Some of the sections are Mark or John writing separately. And one section is by Kathleen Matthews at the end, which is the lore of the courts. So there's a whole section at the end on the courts, and it's a fairly short section. So there's a lot in here. This book starts out with some kind of essays, I would say, and the essays in some cases are kind of Wildwood Tarot deck adjacent. Like they get into topics like how tarot readings might work in terms of kind of the mechanics of tarot. They also discuss some of the kind of lore and mythology and stories related to the specific figures that appear in the deck. There's a section called the Quantum View of Tarot, which is very interesting. There's a section written by Mark Ryan that is almost memoir-like, going through kind of personal experiences and different people he's met and experiences he's had that informed his thinking about these different cards and his thinking about the deck. And this is not a workbook to me, but it's fantastic. If Mark Ryan has a full autobiography or memoir, I would love to read it based on this. I found it very enjoyable to read. Then from 113, page 113 to 156, you get activities. And so this includes things like guided meditations. It includes the idea of making a shrine or altar related to the wildwood. And then it includes a whole bunch of spreads. More spreads anyway than the 3 that you get. And the spreads, I will say, I like. I like the spreads. I don't always like the spreads. I like the spreads, and again, this is where this book could be of interest to someone who isn't necessarily working with the Wildwood or someone who wants a book that is transferable to other decks. The spreads, again, are influenced by and informed by the Wildwood Tarot, but there's no reason that you couldn't do any of these spreads with any deck in your collection. There's an Archer's spread, a Wisdom of the Seasons spread. Okay. Kind of general exploration of choices and changes around an issue spread. A Well at the End of the World spread. There's quite a few. And they're good. I enjoy them. I plan to demonstrate one of them in my Wildwood Tarot deep dive. They're good spreads. The end section of this book also includes some kind of practical exercises for learning the deck, tips for learning how to read court cards, ideas for different ways to read reversals, and this is keyed, of course, to the Wildwood Tarot, but also not limited to it, right? And some of these they cite as being influenced by other tarot authors. So there's an activity to work with the cards that's informed by Rachel Pollack, for example, and they talk about that. Pairing different cards and then swapping the order they appear in. There's all different kinds of suggestions. And they also give you a pretty good resources selection at the end. So tarot sources, science sources, because there's some scientific exploration in some of the essays. Shamanism and Celtic spirituality, other books, a CD with drumming recordings, and then a whole bunch of web resources, some more scholarly than others, dealing with various kind of topics adjacent to things discussed in this book. Okay? So this book, to sum up my thoughts and conclude this long triple book review, this book I would say is not vital to working with the Wildwood Tarot in any way, but if you love the Wildwood Tarot, this will be a really interesting book for you. I think that it has some really good ideas for practicing tarot, for kind of exercises. I think it has some great ideas for spreads that anybody could use. The vast bulk of the book is very Wildwood specific again, as we know from the it's a Wildwood Tarot workbook. So, I wouldn't suggest just picking this up as a kind of general tarot read by any means, but if you like the deck, I think that you will like this book. Just don't expect it to be a workbook in the sense of something like Tarot for Yourself is a workbook, right? Where you fill things in about yourself. It is not that. But it does have lots of fun activities to do, and I think illuminates some interesting influences on the Wildwood Tarot, some of the history of the Wildwood Tarot, some, sense of how Mark Ryan and John Matthews approach the tarot. So if those topics interest you, then I would say to pick up this book. So those are the 3 books that go with the Wildwood Tarot. I hope this has been of some interest. Again, I do plan to make a video discussing the deck in more detail and my experience working with the deck in more detail. In the meantime, if this is a deck that you work with, if it's a deck that you love, please do tell me about it. If you've read these books and you have thoughts that you would like to share, do share those in the comments as well. I love to chat tarot and books. Thanks for watching. I will see you again soon. Bye.